Hey everyone, this is James from TDB, bringing another Inbetweenisode. Today I am going to be talking about a reference tea. This is the 2006 7532. So talking about the 7532 recipe, this is probably the third most well-known Dayi recipe, but I'd say it's, there's a pretty big gap between 8582 and this. 7542 I'd say is probably the most famous recipe of Pu'erh in general, and 8582 is not far behind that. But the 7532 is a little bit more distance. And it's one of those teas that I've had, I think we brought on maybe once, maybe twice onto the show. So it hasn't been covered all that much. And I do think it is still one of those that everyone should try. The numbers are so close to the 7542 that one could think that it is quite similar to it. But in my experience, it's actually quite different to it. Has a fairly different profile. And, to some extent, I'm not sure how much of it is just the versions and the storages that I've tried. That's always an X factor in whenever you're drinking kind of the aged versions of these teas. But I have found it to be a pretty different experience than the 7542, which I feel like leans into this really robust, fruity, woody profile. Here we go. So this was from a Teas We Like blind sampling. So thank you to the folks over there. I am going to assume that it was likely Taiwanese stored, as is most of their teas, but I don't know for certain. And it has a little bit of a greener, grassier smell. That lines up with what I've experienced in the past in 7532s. Of course, that can be a byproduct of a couple things, both the source material as well as the storage. So you don't want to read too much into those, and that's why it's good to get cross examples of teas that are varying ages, varying storages of the same recipe. Cheers. So it definitely has like a pretty upfront bitterness. It's a little different than the 7542. And I was thinking about this tea this is the second steep, by the way, as I was having it, and it reminds me quite a bit, like the grassiness and things like that are things that I don't get that much in 7542, 8582, certainly not of a similar age. And it makes me think that there might be a little more bada mixed in, as is the case in something like the Spring of Munghai. I did have those teas fairly back-to-back, and I think the Spring of Munghai is like the grassier of those teas. And I know that one's a little bit of a polarizing one. It can be a little cheaper. I personally don't mind it at all. I don't necessarily have room for it in the big Pu'erh, which is pretty jam-packed, but I think both of the teas are pretty interesting. So definitely still a little floral, a little grassy. Cheers. It has this sort of like green, grassy, herbal sweetness to it up front, but it has a pretty fast-moving bitterness. I'd say it's very, very different from the 8582, and at least pretty different, too, from the 7542. And we would expect this, compared to the 7542, to have kind of a tippier blend to it because it has a lower leaf grade. So that might be responsible for some of that bitterness too. I think the blend just in general is different as well. Like if I were to, obviously these are blends that have mixed material from all over the place, probably mostly Munghai County for both. But for me at least, the 7542 tastes more of kind of your standard Boulong type thing, and I would guess Bada just being kind of a reputation for being in Munghai Tea Factory tea, usually in blends because you don't see a lot of like Munghai Tea Factory tea Bada, although there are some, and being a very grassy material, that this has a little bit more of that material mixed in. The body is pretty nice. It has like this nice substantive feel to it. It hints at fruit, but it's not nearly as fruity as the 7542. It also hints at wood, but I would say compared to the 8582 and 7542, it's a little bit less woody than both of those. And because it is kind of at that tip of the bitterness, I'm not going to push this too much, because when I did push the 7542 and 8582, they both bit back quite significantly. The aftertaste is pretty good too. It's mostly front of the mouth focused. I would say there's, Pretty minimal depth here, a little bit, but and overall, I would say this is definitely interesting. And 75432 is one of those that I've never felt compelled to actually buy a ton of. It's an interesting tea, but I don't know if it's something that I could see myself drinking regularly. I don't particularly care for that really upfront bitter grassiness. Of course, it could age into something a little more interesting, but the fact that this is 17 years old, predominantly been stored in somewhere like Taiwan, and it still has that, makes me think that it will take quite some time for that to go away. This does have a really nice sweetness accompanying it. I'd say this is like probably this is pretty drinkable, although that kind of greener profile, I'd still say I would prefer to wait a little bit longer. I don't know at what point I would be okay drinking this, like on the regular, maybe in another 5 years or so. Cheers. Some minerals, resin. It's a nice profile overall. And I would say, for me at least, if you wanted to check out the 7532, you should definitely check out a more aged version, sort of like this tea. So if you can track down something in the mid-2000s range, that tends to be where the price tends to kind of drop to a more reasonable level. If you're reaching for the 90s or something, just be prepared to pay quite a bit, certainly for the tea quality for that, just because the production quantity wasn't quite there. You could probably buy something around 2010, I'd imagine, for pretty inexpensively too. So definitely one worth trying. So if I were to sum up, I'd say definitely on the grassier end. The tippiness does show. Pretty different from the 7542, despite them being very close numerically. I think this would be harder to sort of immediately peg as a Dayi tea, although it has, if you were to know it's Dayi tea, you'd be like, okay, that makes a lot of sense there. It has that same sort of robust profile, but I find that the grassiness could be a little misleading, just because sometimes I will associate this grassiness also with more northern tea. So in that sense, this represents perhaps a little bit of a different facet of the Munghai County area and the Munghai Tea Factory in general than something like 7542 and 8582 do. But a really, I would say it's not great, but it's a very solid tea and a solid blend worth checking out. I'd be curious also to compare this versus the 0622. That's one that I believe the 7532 inspired that tea as well. So that's one I have not had in quite a while, but I do have a couple mini cakes from 2006 hanging out back there. So that could be an interesting comparison to do perhaps in the future. But thanks everyone for tuning in. I will see you all next time. Cheers.